Thanks very much, everyone. The session is on regional integration and the African Continental Free Trade Area. And the suggestion was, when we discussed this, that the first part of the session should address the kind of mainstream and heterodox views on trade liberalization and trade policy, as well as on regional integration. So my job is to kind of set the stage in terms of a bit of background theory, and to then hand over to Faizel, who's going to discuss the African economic integration landscape more fully, with a focus on the African Continental Free Trade Area. All right. So just very briefly, I want to give a bit of background on the South African context with respect to trade and industrial policy. And there's a particular reason for that, is to highlight a couple of concepts with respect to this idea of a strategic trade policy and its interaction or linkages with industrial policy. We then look at different notions of comparative advantage and the case for a strategic trade and industrial policy before moving on to some theoretical issues related to regional integration, and particularly the distinction between the mainstream market integration model and the developmental integration approach. All right. I'll make one or two comments, if time permits, on the origins and approaches to regional integration in Southern Africa, but I think Faizel will rather address that more fully. Right, so the brief overview of the South African context is, as I said, really to introduce some key aspects of a so-called strategic trade policy and linkages with industrial policy. In the early post-apartheid period, interestingly, this was the most intense period of trade liberalization in South Africa, and a lot has been written about why that came about, but that's not what I have time to go into here. But this was initiated as part of South Africa's Uruguay round offer, but was actually accelerated beyond what was necessary in terms of our WTO obligations in the period of GEAR, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Program. There were, however, special provisions for sensitive sectors, but the rapid opening of the South African economy led to significant adjustment problems for our local industry, and manufacturing output and employment declined significantly after 1998. There was the much kind of what people expected, who had engaged or had been providing arguments in favor of engaging in the liberalization. The expected growth in manufactured exports, which is usually emphasized in this kind of scenario, only materialized in sectors like autos, where there was already significant industrial support, or in sectors which had already received a lot of support under apartheid industrial policy and were largely competitive by the time the economy opened up. Now, in terms of industrial policy in inverted commas, the accompanying this trade liberalization in the immediate post-apartheid period, there were a series of supply-side industrial policy measures that were introduced to try and mitigate the adverse effects of the rapid liberalization, trade liberalization that was going on. But in practice, these were too small and disparate and also uncoordinated to be called an effective industrial policy, or to be an effective industrial policy in the context of rapid liberalization. And in addition to that, the capital and energy-intensive minerals, energy complex sectors continued to receive significant support without the introduction of what Alice Amsden referred to as reciprocal control mechanisms, where you have certain firms have to comply or undertake certain things in order to benefit from the incentives and protection they receive. Now, also in this period, the BEE policies that were undertaken, as far as the manufacturing sector was concerned, didn't have much success in terms of the development of downstream value-added and labor-absorbing manufacturing and creating a Black industrialist class. But there have been initiatives, as Christian knows very well, in the post-2007 industrial policy landscape, notably the Black Industrialists Program more recently. So after 2007, if we distinguish that, and there's a very nice reading by Nimrod Zalk that distinguishes the apartheid era industrial policy period from the immediate post-1994 liberalization period, and then the post-2007 trade and industrial policy trajectory. And that altered significantly based on a fundamental critique of orthodox trade theory and its policy prescriptions. And it had a lot to do with the individuals who were involved in the trade policy and industrial development divisions at the DTI, as it was at that time. So trade and industrial policy in this period were informed by the National Industrial Policy Framework, the NIPF. Now, that was a fairly short document. It did emphasize the diversification of South Africa's productive structure towards non-traditional tradables, especially manufactured goods, and a more labor-absorbing as well as value-added industrialization trajectory, as well as the support for developing industrial capabilities across the continent. And we'll come back to that a bit later. Now, the implementation plans for the NIPF were called Industrial Policy Action Plans, as many of you know. These were revised 3-year rolling action plans to monitor implementation and achievements. Each revised plan listed the target sectors and any new focus areas, as well as achievements and key action plans. Now, the 2018 IPAP was the last edition that was published. It included what I found very useful, a useful 10-year review, which reflected, it was quite self-critical and quite reflective on what had and hadn't worked, and emphasized both the domestic and external constraints to policy implementation. This is also emphasized in some detail in the Zalk reading. From 2019, South Africa's reimagined industrial strategy was introduced with a focus on 7 priority sectors and the development of sectoral master plans. Now, what's important for us and for the theoretical discussion to follow is the emphasis in the NIPF, which signaled this change in direction, if you like. The emphasis in the NIPF on the need for coherence between industrial policy and other areas of economic policy, particularly for our purpose of today's discussion, particularly trade policy, but also macro policy, technology policy, even competition policy, investment and social policy. Now, with respect to trade policy, the new trajectory emphasized trade policy as an instrument of industrial policy. And this was a different approach to what had gone before, particularly in the immediate post-apartheid period. The NIPF emphasized what was referred to as a strategic tariff policy, where tariff applications would be less ad hoc and assessed rather on a sector-by-sector basis, which took the whole value chain into account. The treatment of tariffs would not be like a wholesale move towards raising tariffs or wholesale removal of tariffs. It would be more nuanced, where machinery and equipment that was needed for building productive capabilities or developing the manufacturing sector locally that were not likely to be on the list of target sectors to be produced locally. Those would have lower tariffs. Also, the lowering of tariffs on upstream inputs to lower input costs for downstream manufacturing, whereas the tariffs on the downstream industries were to be treated more carefully, especially for the value-adding and employment-intensive sectors. So generally a more nuanced approach, where still sort of case by case or sector by sector, but taking the whole value chain into account. This was the theory. More focused export promotion and diversification strategies related to sector strategies, as well as investment policy in line with industrial policy goals and sector strategies. So that was the thinking in the NIPF document. And what we saw by 2010 was the release by the DTI, as it was then, of the 2010 Trade Policy and Strategy Framework document in order to consolidate this attempt to provide better coordination between trade and industrial policy. Together with the 2012 update, there are two key aspects that are important for what we're going to discuss in the theory that follows. First of all, the idea of a developmental trade policy in support of industrial policy, so the TPSF document reinforced this idea of a strategic tariff policy. And then secondly, a policy of so-called strategic integration into the global economy. Now, the idea behind this was, yes, you participate in the world economy, so you're not closing yourself off, but you have policies to preserve, for your negotiating strategies and your policies, to preserve sufficient policy space to pursue your domestic development objectives. Okay. So, and this is not a monolithic type of approach. So there would be multilateral dimensions to the global strategy, regional dimensions, and bilateral aspects as well. Okay. So although the TPSF is currently being updated, and you'll see in your reading pack the 2021 trade policy statement that came out recently, the current policy stance will remain with trade policy as an instrument of industrial policy, but there may be more focus or on South Africa's position on certain other issues like the digital trade and other newer issues that are controversial now in the context of the WTO. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but I mentioned that the strategic global integration has puts forward, South Africa's position at the multilateral level, its commitment to the completion of the Doha round according to the Doha Development Mandate. And then at the regional and continental level, South Africa favors this developmental integration approach, which we will discuss a little bit further on, emphasizing building industrial capabilities through the development of regional value chains across the continent. And South Africa's approach in terms of deepening versus broadening existing FTAs will come up a little bit later as well. And then at inter-regional and bilateral levels with emerging economy partners, South Africa's adopted a cautious approach with preferential trade agreements that are initially fairly limited, or else strategic partnership agreements such as that with China, which emphasizes the need to improve the value-added content of South Africa's exports to China. And more broadly, to structure trade and investment relations with emerging economies in ways that take account of industrial development or industrial policy goals. South Africa was obviously part of the contested SADC EPA negotiations, which is on an interregional level as well, and has had a lot of issues. But the reason I wanted to highlight that background was to pick up on this idea, first of all, of a strategic trade policy, and secondly, if we have time, of the strategic integration into the global economy in a little bit more detail, looking at the theoretical arguments that underpin those approaches. So we move on then to look at the different notions or ideas of comparative advantage and what the rationale is underlying the so-called strategic trade and industrial policy approach. So it's a much more nuanced idea that we want to emphasize compared to the old-fashioned, binary of free trade versus protection. So it's a totally different kind of more sophisticated approach. So now we've heard in the course a lot about how industrial policy has enjoyed something of a resurgence, especially since the global financial crisis. And there are a number of reasons for that that have been touched on throughout some of the presentations. So what we find is that the debate nowadays may have become less about whether to have industrial policy and more about on what the instruments and scope of this industrial policy should be, including your role of the state in industrial policy debate. So there's still very different perspectives about how to undertake industrial policy and on the interaction between trade policy and industrial policy, with the role of ideology and power relations and power imbalances continuing to form an important part of the debate. So the orthodox approach to trade policy, of course, makes the case for trade liberalization on the basis of improvements in static allocative efficiency and for dynamic gains from trade. So the traditional trade theories, the Ricardian and Heckscher-Ohlin trade theories, tell us that countries should specialize in trade according to their static comparative advantage, producing what they are least bad at, relative or relatively good at. So Hudson Chang reminds us that the source of comparative advantage differs in these mainstream theories, Ricardian and Heckscher-Ohlin. In the Ricardian theory, the comparative advantage comes about due to differences in technologies between countries. In other words, differences in productive capabilities. However, the theory does not explain these differences, how they came about, or how to change them. It takes them as given. In the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the comparative advantage is due to differences in relative factor endowments. This implies that technology is the same for each product and can be used by any country. In other words, productive capabilities are the same across countries. And this obviously assumes away the importance of developing productive capabilities in order to change your comparative advantage and to develop. So obviously in the development context, then the static resource reallocation effects, which are the ones of changes you get when you liberalize trade, are of little concern for developing countries. Developing countries are interested in changing the structure of production and trade as part of the development process, as we've discussed extensively in this course. In addition to that, the estimates of static gains from trade are very questionable. They're typically small and based on special assumptions and questionable indicators. Theoretically, in the mainstream theory with respect to the dynamic gains from trade or the dynamic effects, the theoretical models linking trade and growth provide ambiguous conclusions, and both the theoretical and empirical literature have been subject to extensive critique by a wide range of authors with respect to in the case of the empirical literature, the empirical methodologies undertaken and the conclusions that have been derived on those faulty methodologies. From this body of work, the mainstream, both the theoretical and empirical, we can't presume that liberalization on its own is going to accelerate growth. The adverse effects may be severe, balance of payments and employment effects. The price and export responses that are promised may not be forthcoming, and distributional impacts both within and between countries are often adverse. While growth itself is necessary, it might not generate jobs or meaningful development in and of itself. Furthermore, in the mainstream trade policy view, it's assumed that the transfer of production technology and other knowledge is costless and immediate, and that such technology is readily absorbed universally. But we know that technologies are not blueprints that can be costlessly applied in other countries. And as has been emphasized in numerous presentations in the course, time is needed for learning by doing, for developing technological capabilities, and absorbing and adapting advanced technologies. So these arguments provide a rationale for the use of strategic trade and industrial policy instruments. And the conclusion of a large body of work is that orthodox trade theory provides us with an insufficient framework for looking at growth and development through industrialization in developing countries, or even productive transformation strategies more broadly. And of course, as we'll hear in the lecture by Antonio Andreoni, the reorganization of production and trade in global value chains also has significant implications for the traditional trade policy analysis and its policy prescriptions. However, as Hudson Chang tells us, comparative advantage sectors are still important, you need your comparative advantage sectors to earn foreign exchange through exports in order to acquire what you need for developing your domestic productive capabilities. All right, the chapter 3 in that transformative industrial policy report is very useful in this regard. So what we see is that if we're going to consider the dynamic impact of trade, it should lead us to a different conception of comparative advantage, a dynamic idea of comparative advantage and dynamic efficiency. And there's literature on this both in the structuralist tradition and also in the evolutionary economist tradition. So the suggestion is that comparative advantage should be created, which of course has implications for your trade and industrial policy. At the same time, what we mean by dynamic comparative advantage and by creating comparative advantages means different things to different people. And you've been referred by a couple of lecturers to a 2009 paper where Justin Lin, former World Bank chief economist, Chinese, and Hajin Chang have a debate on their different conceptions of comparative advantage. In the heterodox literature, as we know from our structural change lectures, the argument is that the type of product or activity in which you specialize is of major importance for your development trajectory. And the output, because the output and growth consequences differ significantly for increasing returns activities versus decreasing returns activities. Now, Chang discusses the theory of infant industry promotion, no longer calling it protection to avoid that kind of simplistic dichotomy. The theory of infant industry promotion, which sees, in contrast to very basic comparative advantage theory, which sees the development of productive capabilities as key for development. So the infant industry theory agrees with the Ricardian theory that countries have different productive capabilities, but differs significantly by arguing that these capabilities can and should be developed over time with appropriate policy interventions. Industrial policy can play a key role here. So we see again the linkage or the interaction between the trade and industrial policy by promoting industries with appropriate linkages. We've discussed this earlier in the course. Harnessing technology transfer and developing local technological capabilities. We'll hear more about that tomorrow as well as underwriting the risk of investment projects that would otherwise not occur. In their debate on the different conceptions of dynamic comparative advantage, Lin and Chang discuss what we can call comparative advantage conforming versus comparative advantage defying approaches, where Justin Lin's approach is more comparative advantage conforming, but it's nuanced. It's not just you must follow your static comparative, it's dynamic. But I'll come back to that, versus Chang's approach. The Lin proposes what is called a growth identification and facilitation approach, which is discussed in one of your readings and in his paper, chapter in that book. It's still a neoclassical approach with optimizing individuals. And his story is that an economy at any moment is defined by its factor endowments, but these together with the institutions define an economic structure that determines its path. So what policy needs to do, what industrial policy should do, trade and industrial policy should facilitate that path with the right institutions to new endowments and structures. So it's a notion of following your underlying or latent comparative advantage as opposed to your comparative advantage defying activities. And I'll refer you again to that debate where they go back and forth on this for quite an entertaining exchange. Justin Lin's approach, as Chang argues, doesn't recognize that many countries have moved beyond their latent comparative advantages by implementing riskier comparative advantage defying policies. And that Lin's approach also ignores the dynamics of technological upgrading, learning and capabilities. So the arguments for a more comparative advantage defying policies don't just argue that these should be followed wholesale. They still see a role for your comparative advantage industries, particularly in earning foreign exchange. But there is a critique by Chang and Andrioni in a couple of papers of the strategic trade and industrial policy literature about a number of issues that need more attention to be paid. Some authors pay attention to these, but in differing degrees. And more attention, in their view, needs to be paid to linkages and the balance between different sectors of the economy, particularly between, but not only between agriculture and manufacturing. We've had lectures on why that should be the case, why more attention should be paid to the blurring of boundaries between the different sectors and so on. Also, the balance between sectors within manufacturing. Okay, we've had a discussion of that as well in the course so far. Pros and cons of different instruments of industrial policy. That would be great to discuss, but we don't have time to go into the details of that in this session. The effects of financialization and better coherence between macro and industrial policy. This is often very underemphasized, the importance of the coherence between your macro policy and your industrial policy. And then finally, they argue that more emphasis should be given on policy implementation issues, which is something we can relate to in our context, particularly with the post-2007 experience with industrial policy here, including rent management institutions, local capabilities, and Khan's work on political settlements. Right, so there are a number of issues relating to that final emphasis on implementation and coordination issues, which I'll pick up very briefly, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because Mushtaq has gone over this extensively with the rent management and political settlements discussion. But a major issue is that we know that there's this, we've established that there is a strong theoretical rationale for a strategic trade and industrial policy, both because of the shortcomings of the mainstream approach, but also because of the arguments of the strategic trade and industrial policy literature itself, apart from the whole empirical experience that supports it. But there are a range of issues to consider in terms of policy implementation. And this is probably, as Mushtaq has said, the most difficult part of it. There is, however, significant literature, as we know, on how to reduce policy failures and improve chances of a successful strategic policy. In chapter 3 that we've referred you to in the Chang et al. Transformative Industrial Policy for Africa, there's an overview of these issues, which Chang and the co-authors divide into policy design, management of policy implementation, and political economy factors, which are obviously not mutually exclusive, but interlinked. Just very briefly, in terms of the policy design, realistic target industries and a realistic assessment of target industries is necessary. And we've mentioned projects with varying risk profiles, including both your comparative advantage defying and your comparative advantage conforming industries. The importance of an export strategy is emphasized, both to earn the foreign exchange that you need, but also to help achieve economies of scale and provide market discipline to protected firms and a way to judge their performance. Policy adaptability is very important, and we can relate to this extensively in the context of the current crisis in the face of external factors or external shocks. And anyway, industrial policy will need to evolve over time as firms move up the technology ladder. With respect to managing the policy implementation, it's both administrative capabilities and incentive design. The most important thing in the incentive design is the inclusion of what Amsden refers to as reciprocal control mechanisms. And this has been discussed already by Mushtaq. But also the other point that he emphasizes is the importance of organizational capabilities. So people can have strong individual capabilities, but would have a low levels of productivity in a setting where the organizational capabilities are weak. However, having absent capabilities isn't a reason not to do industrial policy, as some of the international financial institutions would have had us believe, but it's rather an argument for building the necessary capabilities and capacity. All right, coordination is also critical alongside administrative and organizational capabilities, and includes cooperation between different state agencies responsible for policy implementation. So this is a big factor that's been an issue in the South African context, because lack of internal policy coherence can be a major constraint. Right, we've discussed incentive design and the need for performance targets and reciprocal control mechanisms. The political economy issues, as I said, this is not separate, it's intertwined with the other factors. And the importance of what Peter Evans refers to as embedded autonomy, the way in which government interacts with various societal actors, but has its own will and capacity to carry out the necessary policies. Right, that's the embeddedness and the autonomy. It's not just state-societal relations that have interest. The institutional structure and organization of the state itself obviously has significant impact on developmental outcomes, and there's a big literature on this. We've mentioned the problem with the lack of internal policy coherence driven by special interests and ideological differences, even within departments or between different departments, are very important. Khan expands on all of these issues in his work on rent management, institutions, and political settlements, as we know. So the case for strategic trade and industrial policy has to be bolstered by a very detailed analysis of the kinds of implementation and coordination problems that are likely to be experienced in practice. So for the last part of my input, I just want to ask the question, moving on to the regional integration context, of whether we can extend this idea discussed in the previous section of a strategic trade and industrial policy from the national to the regional level. If we look at the mainstream or textbook treatment of regional integration, it's largely based on neoclassical trade theory, and specifically the theory of customs unions put forward by Jacob Weiner and later elaborated by Lipsey and others. Underlying this mainstream neoclassical static view of economic integration are the concepts of trade creation and trade diversion, which form the basis of the analysis. Your trade creation, when you form a regional union, refers to the replacement of domestic production with relatively cheaper imports from a partner country, while your trade diversion refers to the replacement of relatively cheaper imports from the rest of the world with imports from a partner country that are now tariff-free. So in the static welfare analysis, free trade area or customs union is beneficial in inverted commas if trade creation outweighs trade diversion. Okay, this is quite a short-sighted approach, which we'll come back to that in a minute, but it gives you a set of orthodox conditions, if you like, that the mainstream literature puts forward for a successful FTA or customs union based on these static concepts. So in terms of the static theory, the trade creation is more likely to outweigh trade diversion if countries are at similar levels of development, have competitive production structures with the potential to become complementary. If your domestic production is high relative to your imports, because that will mean the trade diversion is relatively less compared to trade creation. If the potential partners trade relatively more with each other and less with the rest of the world prior to integration. So these are the conditions under which, in the mainstream welfare analysis, the FTA will be welfare enhancing. There's very little relevance in the developing country context of the static analysis. What developing countries are interested in, rather, as we've said before, is changing the existing patterns of trade and production to facilitate development. So they are interested in the dynamic effects of regional integration, not the static resource reallocation effects. And if you go back and even look at the concepts of trade creation and trade diversion, trade creation is involving replacing domestic industry with imports from your partner. And that, for a start, is a problematic concept for a country trying to engage in industrialization. Likewise, trade diversion as a concept is supposed to be welfare reducing, but it's defined as less imports from the rest of the world and more imports within your regional grouping. So there are arguments for promoting that kind of trade as opposed to measuring it as welfare reducing. So the static concepts are very problematic in the context of regional integration among developing countries. And what we're interested rather is the dynamic impacts and what these are. So this includes, note that they're not all positive, of course. It depends on your regional grouping. Economies of scale in a larger regional market, investment effects, and those can be polarizing or beneficial, the impact on competition, reduced uncertainty, and the polarization effect. So particularly in integration among countries at unequal levels of development, you may have polarization of industrial activity and investment, where these are attracted to the more developed member states in the integration arrangement. But much of the mainstream theory does talk about dynamic effects, but much of the analysis of dynamic effects in the mainstream theory and even the extension based on new trade theory don't engage with the development context effectively. It's mainly associated with the market imperfection school of neoclassical economics, where the policy prescriptions underlying the discussion is still free trade. So there's little contemporary analysis of regional integration as an instrument of industrialization in the mainstream, what we refer to as the market integration literature. Arguments in the mainstream often see regional integration among developing countries as a stepping stone to broader and deeper liberalization and the insertion of these countries into the global free trade system. So you don't see a lot you don't see political economy and political settlement issues being discussed in the mainstream literature on economic integration and how they would impact on developing country regional integration initiatives, or the international configuration of power, as it was referred to in earlier lectures. Also, the mainstream literature tends to focus on trade in goods in the theory, whereas the analysis of the implications of having services and investment provisions of regional trade agreements for development is poor or underdeveloped, or they transfer their arguments inappropriately from trade in goods arguments. And also financialization and macro aspects are neglected. So the implications of negotiating newer generation trade issues in the developing country context, both amongst developing countries and in North-South trade agreements, is completely neglected. Very briefly then, the market integration model, as we know, proposes a linear step-by-step approach to economic integration. The deeper your level of integration or the higher up the ladder you go, the more policy space you forego within your regional grouping. The different levels of integration are defined in economic terms, just to point out the difference between a free trade area and a customs union, because it's important for the development integration argument. The FTA has free trade between the member countries, whereas a customs union is a free trade area in which there is a common external tariff. And then a common market goes further with free movements of capital and labor. So the market integration model recommends that integration proceeds on the basis of this linear progression from an FTA to customs union, common market economic union. But as we'll argue, it's an inappropriate paradigm for developing countries, and not least because of integration arrangements usually involve countries at very different levels of development. Right. Now, moving on then to the development integration approach, just in the last few minutes. The integration among developing countries requires different approaches to regional integration, especially among countries at unequal levels of development. Mechanisms are needed to address the distribution of the gains from integration. And even this can be problematic for the more developed partners in the grouping, which have domestic or national inequality and unemployment issues on a large scale. Alternative approaches that have been discussed in the literature include functional integration and development integration. Functional integration is known as integration through project cooperation, where countries cooperate. You don't have trade liberalization, but countries cooperate rather on sectoral projects in areas such as transport, energy, and infrastructure. This was the functional integration informed the early Southern African Development Coordination Conference, as it was called before SADC, when it was formed in 1980 in response to the apartheid government's regional destabilization policy. So examples could include a regional hydropower project or regional transport corridors, etc. At present, however, the favored approach, certainly by the South African policymakers, seems to be a developmental integration approach. Here, regional integration is viewed as a vehicle for industrial development and is seen as a way to lower the cost of developing productive capabilities through access to a larger regional market. There are three pillars, if you like, that are referred to. The first is your trade integration or market integration, where you do lower tariffs between the member states. But this is coupled with infrastructure development and industrial development. Some argue that market integration to the level of an FTA is preferable to deepening to a customs union, because with an FTA, countries can still use their tariff as an industrial policy tool, whereas a customs union has a common external tariff. So there's an emphasis in the development integration literature, and this has been written about extensively by both Rod Davies and Faizel. Cooperation in transport and infrastructure development, a regional industrial development policy, the development of regional value chains, and regional trade facilitation and the lowering of non-tariff barriers. So the important thing about development integration is that it additionally recognizes the importance of mechanisms to ensure balanced development, although there's a lot of debate on what mechanisms or what form of mechanisms should be included in a developing country regional integration arrangement. And these debates go all the way back to the heyday of Latin American integration arrangements in the 50s and 60s. So some mechanisms could include a regional industrial policy, a regional development banks, compensatory payments mechanisms, and asymmetric tariff reductions, and investment flows that are development oriented. Amongst these mechanisms, some are seen as more effective than others, or have longer staying power, if you like. So a comprehensive regional industrial strategy is most favored together with a regional development bank. Asymmetric tariff reductions, that means that the more advanced countries reduce their tariffs more slowly than the other, more quickly than the other countries. Asymmetric tariff reduction, that's obviously a temporary, that's not a long-term mechanism. And compensatory payments mechanisms can perpetuate dependencies, or the payments may not be spent on development projects. You can get a lot of conflict in such regional integration arrangements. Another important aspect of development integration is collaboration in international forums. But there are difficulties with this as well in establishing common positions at regional and continental levels, and that's where your political economy factors become so important. All right, so that's just to try and give you a flavor of, as far as the regional integration debate is concerned, concerned on the clear difference between the market integration approach and the development integration approach, which has become more emphasized both in the Southern African and certainly in the national context, in the national policy documents and debates in South Africa. I see I've come to the end of my time. So what I'd like to do is, I'm sure that Faizel will, when he discusses the African Continental Free Trade Area or introduces it, he'll make reference to the origins and approaches to regional integration on the continent and how there have been a shift from the early development through industrialization approach to a more market integration period. And now perhaps we hope a shift back to a more developmental integration approach. But I think I'll stop there and hand over to Faizel. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Niki. You've done an absolutely fabulous job. I don't know how you did it, but you've covered an enormous amount of ground, going through a huge literature on the theory of trade and industrialization and the linkages between trade policy and industrial policy, which is extremely important. And often in the literature and in practice, trade theorists tend to be, focused on trade policy, and they often do not make the linkages with industrial policy and development, and vice versa. And practitioners, I know from my own experience, tend to be either trade negotiators and trade policy experts or industrial policy practitioners and experts, and often they don't talk to each other very much. So you'll find that in the area that I know well, which is trade negotiations, in Geneva and elsewhere, a lot of the people who were my contemporaries were people who worked on trade and reported to the trade departments, and they often didn't talk to their industrial policy counterparts, in government. So this is a real problem. So I thank Niki for bringing these two together, linking the theories, and I think she's made a wonderful case for why we need to be taking a broader approach than the mainstream neoclassical approaches to trade theory. So that saves me from having to dwell on that. So I'm very pleased to be part of this lecture and APORDE training program, because I think it's really fabulous to have so many global thinkers who are all working on heterodox theory across a broad front of areas. And I think that you are all extremely privileged to have such an array of people to be presenting to you. I myself listened in to Mushtaq Khan the other day, was absolutely impressed. And I will try to listen in to a few others. So thanks so much. I also am pleased that some of my students are in this class today, and I'm very pleased that you have the opportunity to participate in such a fabulous program. So thanks so much to Niki for working with me in this lecture and in this program. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about trade theory in this presentation, but Niki has done most of the work for me. But what I will do is talk a little bit more about African integration and why Africa needs to integrate, and then a quick overview of the history of trade integration in Africa. And then I'll take the process that Niki talked about, the development of trade integration, the literature on that. We'll talk a bit about that. I build on that literature in my own work, on what I call developmental regionalism. That's my most recent publication, which I've set for you to have a look at. I'll talk a bit about that and unpack that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the AfCFTA negotiations, what's going on right now. And I'll try to bring you into the negotiations today. All right, so on the trade theory, Niki has covered it much better than I would have. If I had to give the same lecture, I don't think I could do it in the same way. She's covered really in a great deal of detail. She's given you the background to the theory and also the nuanced differences between the mainstream comparative advantage, Ricardian approaches to trade and the heterodox approaches to trade integration, the more developmental integration approaches to trade. And she's explained those differences. So I just want to go back to perhaps the key concepts on trade integration, which we learned from Jacob Weiner. So Jacob Weiner was the first theoretician and a trade economist who came up with these concepts. He kind of locked them in and gave them a definition, a technical definition, which is important because these concepts have remained with us. So from the 1950s, when Jacob Weiner started writing this, he explained his observation about what was happening in the world of trade and trade integration. And he looked around him and he saw these, what he called linear progression. All right, great. So as I was saying, Jacob Weiner's approach, which lives with us today, observed these linear steps in the process of trade integration. So the first step, he said, in trade integration, he observed to be a preferential trading arrangement where two or more countries would come together. They would agree on a selective reduction of tariffs, and they would then exchange. There would be a reciprocal exchange of these tariff concessions, and you would then have a preferential trading arrangement. Now, if these same countries, two or more of them, then said, well, look, we needed to go further than this. We needed to reduce all our tariffs, or almost all our tariffs, to zero over a certain period of time. He said that would then become a free trade area. So that would be step two. Now, if the same countries wanted to deepen their integration even further, they would agree to then create a common external tariff. So to harmonize the external tariff. In other words, whether you are going into the European Union from, say, Brussels or from Rotterdam or from Berlin, you would pay the same tariff if you were exporting citrus from South Africa or BMW 3 Series from South Africa, into the European Union. If you went into any of the markets in any of the countries, you would pay the same tariff. So because they've harmonized their common external tariff. Okay, now he said, if you went further than this, if you wanted to deepen your integration, you could then, in addition to the free movement of goods and an external tariff, you could now have the free movement of capital and labor. And you would, you would unblock, take the borders off, and you would not have to have visas, for workers to move between these countries. They could, if they got a job, they could move. And he said, well, you could go even further than that. So this he called a common market. The fourth step was a common market, when you you went beyond a customs union, you integrated capital and labor as well. Now, you could do even more than that. You could agree to start harmonizing your interest rates. And you would say, look, let our central banks cooperate. And perhaps, we could just do away with the different central banks and have one central bank setting the interest rate for all of us. And we could also cooperate on fiscal taxes, like, say, excise taxes. And in this case, he said these countries would then be creating an economic and monetary union. So that's step 5. Now, remember, Jacob Weiner is an American. He's writing in the 1950s. He's looking around him. What does he see? He sees a situation where these steps have been followed. And the final step, he says, is one where the countries that become a common and monetary union agree to go further and coordinate their foreign policy and perhaps, create a federal structure, creating one national union. Now, does anyone know which country he was talking about when he was describing this process? The United States of America. So this is how the United States itself, step by step, integrated, and how it came together finally in the United States of America. Now, why this is important is because these economic concepts that Jacob Weiner developed still remain. So when we talk about regional integration, when we describe the European Union, we still use the same concepts. Of course, things have evolved a little bit more. In the European Union, they also began to reduce services in the 1980s, and services trade was not really regarded as a tradable good in the time when Jacob Weiner was writing in the 1950s. In fact, services only became part of the WTO, part of the GATT WTO in the Uruguay round in the 1980s. And so therefore, the European Union started talking about a single market, which went beyond a customs union. So it was when they started integrating their services, they created a single market. So a single market would be something that would go beyond a customs union, would be, say, the step after a customs union. So the EU is arguably currently also a single market. Okay, so we'll come back. We'll use those concepts as we discuss the case of Africa. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about why does Africa need to integrate? There is a literature, and I'm sure you've read some of this literature about integration and Africa, their history, and the rationale. And when I look at the literature, I see perhaps one of the most important reasons, economic reasons for integration, is that Africa needs to integrate because almost all the countries on the continent, including South Africa, are not sufficiently large enough. The market size is not sufficiently large enough for the countries on the continent to become viable, competitive economies in the global economy. Africa is got now about 55 economic spaces. 34 of them are least developed countries. So even a country may be large in size, maybe have like Tanzania, a large economy, or Ethiopia, a large country in population, but poor when it comes to its economic development. They are LDCs. 6 of them are small island developing states, like, say, Mauritius. Take the case of Seychelles. How many people in the Seychelles? Less than 100,000, about 97,000. So small and island states. 16 of them are landlocked developing countries. And some of them are LDCs, small island states, and some of them are also some LDCs are also landlocked. So you see some of these LDCs are landlocked countries. So what this means is that if a country like Zambia wants to export its copper to global markets, what does it have to do? It can't ship it out, by plane. It has to do it by road and rail and the nearest port. It needs the cooperation of its neighbors, like Malawi, like Zimbabwe, like Mozambique. Perhaps it needs cooperation of Angola. And similarly, other countries like Rwanda. If Rwanda wants to export bulk commodities, it needs Burundi, it needs Kenya, it needs the port of Mombasa. So countries that are landlocked need to cooperate with their neighbors. So they are conditioned, these are necessary conditions for integration. Now you may ask, why is it that Africa has not integrated as fast as it should have, given that there are economic necessities, there are compelling economic reasons for African countries to cooperate, to unite. If you look at the evidence, you see that according to the data, the official data in the last data that seems to be sticking with us, it's about 18% of Africa's intra-regional trade is with itself, or rather 18% of its trade with the world is with itself, is intra-regional. And that number has not really grown, at least the formal trade has not grown. Informally, that number may be much larger than 18%. It could even be double that. Informal trade, unrecorded trade, which is not documented, but the formal trade is relatively low. Compare that with the European Union, where 70% of Europe's trade with the world is with itself. So 70% of, say, Germany's trade with the world is with itself. And you see a similar trend in North America and also in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, where a large part of intra-regional trade, or rather a large part of these countries' global trade is intra-regional. So they trade with themselves more than with the rest of the world, increasingly, because it's more efficient to trade with your neighbors and than with the rest of the world, because of all the transaction costs. You have to pay for the transport and a range of other costs to your global trade. So intra-regional trade is increasing. This is a trend in many other parts of the continent, and Africa itself needs to catch up. But Africa has started. Africa is large. There's a large growing market now of over 1 billion people, over $3.3 trillion, and a process has begun. Now, of course, there is a long history to this process. You'll recall that, African countries are relatively young in their history of independence. Ghana became independent in 1957, the first country in a wave of independence struggles that resulted in these countries being granted independence. Often they have been won through liberation movements, fighting for freedom. But many countries began this process of becoming independent. But even before the independence of Ghana, there were visions, there were ideas, there were leaders of these liberation movements who wanted to build a united Africa when they returned. So we call this the Pan-Africanist vision. The writings of Kwame Nkrumah, of Senghor, of Cabral, and even of Oliver Tambo and others, when they were abroad, they did have a vision that they would begin a process of building unity, because of many of these formations, the countries on the continent were created by the colonial countries in the boardrooms of, in Whitehall in London, or the Berlin Conference. The borders were created. And so these leaders felt that when they returned, they would strive to build a united Africa. But of course, it took some time before they could start this process. Challenges of neo-colonialism and a conflict about borders, the Cold War, these held them back. But they did start in 1964. They created the Organization of African Unity. And in 1975, a fellow called Dr. Adebayo Adedeji, a great thinker from Nigeria, who became the first executive secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, he led a process of thinking in the OAU for the integration of the continent. And the first document that he introduced for discussion was called the Lagos Charter. And then it became known a few years later, after more elaboration, it became known as an action plan, a Lagos action plan. And with further elaboration, this plan became a more elaborate strategy for and framework for integration of the continent. And this was called the Abuja Treaty. It was adopted in 1991. It still remains the main framework for integration on the continent today. So it's still relevant. It still informs the thinking of the continent. And in this treaty, Adebayo Adedeji, actually, he did have a similar vision as the step-by-step linear approach adopted by the theory that informed regional integration. And Jacob Weiner's approach was something he had in mind. And he said, well, look, we need to start integration somewhere. Let's do this in a step-by-step way. And let's do this in each of the sub-regions. He said the continent is too large. Let's do it, in Southern Africa and East Africa and West Africa. We'll start with the preferential trade arrangement and then move on to free trade and then customs union. And then we'll get to an African economic community by 2028. So that was his vision, very elaborate and spelt out in the Abuja Treaty. Now, remember, it was the 1980s and the 1990s. It was not the most conducive time for African countries to implement regional integration. Why? Because this was the most troubled time for Africa, economically speaking. Most countries were experiencing low growth, economic crisis, balance of payments problems, high levels of debt. And many of these African countries had to then succumb to the policy prescriptions of the World Bank and IMF in what were called structural adjustment programs. And these structural adjustment programs followed the neoliberal approaches that were informed by this Ricardian comparative advantage ideas. It called for rapid liberalization. It also called for austerity programs, for deregulation, for privatization of state-owned enterprises. And of course, it didn't work. So even the bank itself, the World Bank, had done several studies much later, of course, which came to the conclusion that these policies didn't work because they were too aggressive. They called for too radical steps in the direction of trade liberalization, and they didn't take sufficient account of the need for adjustments. And of course, the magic of the theory didn't work. The magic was that, you know, the more you liberalized, you would then see the reallocation of resources to those sectors that had comparative advantage, and the growth rates would rise, and it didn't happen. So, of course, the continent was at the end of the last century. As we got to the end of it, many people were pessimistic, like the Economist, you know, in its 2020 edition, it described the continent as Africa, the hopeless continent. It reflected a very poor state of affairs. Of course, it was also pejorative. But as the Economist was writing that, Africa's fate was changing. There was a dramatic change in the East. The Chinese economy was growing at an exponential rate of 10% per annum throughout the 1980s and the 90s. And it began to suck in imports of commodities. Most of those commodities were coming from the continent, from Latin America as well. And it caused a rise of commodity prices, pushing up Africa's growth rates. And we saw, for the first time, the continent's growth rate rising by an average of 5% per annum from about 2002, 2003 for the next 5 or 6 years. And this caused an incredible shift in the narrative about Africa. And you then see, you know, McKinsey and others saying Africa is rising, and Africa is on the move, or lions are on the move, and the middle class begins to grow, investors begin to take more interest, and this causes a change on the continent itself, where leaders now have the policy space to begin to reignite the process of regional integration in Africa. Now, what happens? As they look at the continent and see what can we do about regional integration, they see that actually there's a bit of a messy situation, because in the 1980s and the 90s, there was no real space for African leaders to move in a systematic way towards regional integration. And so what they did was they began to talk to each other in a rather haphazard way about bilateral economic relationships. And they signed on to all sorts of treaties. And many of these treaties they signed were actually contradictory. They contradicted the others. They were inconsistent with commitments made in one arrangement and commitments made in another arrangement. So, for example, Swaziland is part of a customs union with Insaku, with Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and South Africa. Swaziland is now Eswatini. And Eswatini also has had a relationship with COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. It joined COMESA and said, we want to also join you. And COMESA decided to create a customs union. So now Eswatini is committed to 2 customs unions. Now, as you know from the theory of customs unions, as described by Jacob Weiner, a customs union has to have a common external tariff, one common external tariff. Now, you can't be part of 2 common external tariffs. By definition, if you have 2 common external tariffs, then you'll end up with 1 common external tariff, because then 2 common external tariffs, if you're part of both of them, the only way you can be consistent and fulfill your obligations to both of them is if the two of them come together. Now, of course, COMESA and SACU were not going to come together. And similarly, we saw this in different regions. So the same thing happened, in East Africa. Kenya was part of several. Tanzania was part of SADC, agreed in SADC to become a customs union, then also agreed with the EAC, the East African Community, that we'll become a customs union too. So, of course, you can't be part of two customs unions, they have to choose. So this discussion on the continent led to at least three of the regions having a meeting in June of 2011. The Southern African Development Community, East African Community, and COMESA had a joint meeting of the presidents. And they said, look, how are we going to solve this puzzle? We need to regularize these arrangements. And so they thought, look, the best way forward is if they took two steps. So the first step had been taken with preferential trade. They said, why don't we just move to the next step of free trade and have one consistent arrangement, free trade arrangement between all of us, a trilateral free trade agreement across the African continent. And in this way, we will be able to, fast track the process of regional integration. And they saw this as an opportunity to then, grow their economies, build regional cooperation, and across 26 countries, $1 trillion at least of GDP, going from Cape Town all the way to Cairo. So this was a very exciting development at the time. You may remember it, some of you, in 2011. And by 2015, they managed to actually agree. They had a number of negotiating meetings with the officials, with ministers and presidents during the period between 2011 and 2015. They worked on a protocol on trade in goods. They negotiated it painstakingly, and they agreed on a free trade area. Now, when they had a meeting of the free trade to launch the free trade, the trilateral free trade agreement, the other guys, who are from this part, the west part of Africa, they were not part of this free trade process. So they were observing it, but, I think they may have been a bit skeptical at the beginning. But when they saw that, our neighbors have all, started, have concluded a free trade agreement, so the rest of the continent decided to join in. So then Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and many of the countries on the West and Central Africa said, look, why don't we also participate? And so they launched in June of 2015, they launched for the first time a Continental Free Trade Agreement, CFTA, a Continental Free Trade. They said, let's add, to this, the two sides of the continent, the East and the West. And fortunately, a lot of work had been done, but there was very intense work. And I was very impressed with the intensity of the negotiations. Each of the regions, the sub-regions, contributed. They participated as customs unions, where they like SACU, for example, and the EAC, and they succeeded in reaching an agreement by March 2018. They had agreed on a framework agreement. So the framework agreement set out the broad parameters of the free trade agreement, the principles, and the scope of the free trade agreement. They also agreed at this stage to 3 protocols: a protocol on trade in goods, a protocol in trade in services, and a dispute settlement mechanism. So by 2018, they had an outline, a framework agreement, and 3 protocols. it was quite historic for this to have happened. It wasn't smooth sailing. There were some challenges. By this stage, South Africa was not able to sign at that meeting in March 2018. They said they needed further consultations at home. The cabinet, and Nigeria was not able to attend the meeting at all because they had not consulted sufficiently at home. And so then there was a next meeting and the next summit took place a few months later in Mauritania. At that meeting, South Africa joined. And at the following meeting in Niger, in July 2019, Nigeria had joined, and the AfCFTA had officially entered into force because the necessary, the number of countries that were supposed to have ratified the treaty had ratified it. They had set out 22 needed to ratify, 22 had signed, and the agreement was now in force. It now needed to be legally enforced, that is, it needed to be implemented. And they had agreed to implement as from July 2020. Unfortunately, they were not able to do so because when we got to, as you know, we got to 2020, by February 2020, we were all in trouble. COVID-19 was raging around the world and on the continent. And so things slowed down. There were lockdowns in many countries. So they decided to rather postpone the implementation to January of 2021. It was a difficult time for the AfCFTA because it was just launching. It had just created a secretariat, and the Secretary General was appointed, Wamke Lemene, the first Secretary General, and it had serious challenges with beginning to implement. Although they had launched on the 1st of January, they were not able to implement for one important reason, and that was that the rules of origin, I'll come back and explain that, the rules of origin for a number of tariff lines were not yet agreed. So what had happened was countries had started making offers to each other on the reduction of tariffs, and they had agreed to a large number of tariffs being reduced to zero, and I'll come back to that. But they had not yet agreed on the value added. So one of the technical issues in trade negotiations is that if you agree that we will open each other's markets to each other, so we will reduce the duties, but we will only reduce the duties on those goods that are produced in your country by a certain percentage, at least, of value added must be added in your country. If you simply import a good from another country, a third country, and you don't add any value to those goods, you simply then export it, you re-export it, in other words. You import it and you re-export it. In other words, you are now trans-shipping. You are, say, Mozambique imports goods from China, it then exports it directly to South Africa. Mozambique is just trans-shipping. It's not, and if it doesn't add any value to those goods, then those goods will not be admitted to South Africa as part of a bilateral free trade agreement that Mozambique may have with South Africa. So similarly, the free trade agreement of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has to have rules about how much of value added for each of these products must be from the continent itself, by countries on the continent. And for each of the tariff lines, there is a negotiation about what the percentage is, how much of value should be added, how much should be added in the country, what kind of transformation of the goods should take place, whether it should be wholly produced on the continent itself for it to qualify to be part of the free trade agreement or not. So by the time we got to, say, last month or this month, 1st of September this year, the negotiators are still negotiating. They have not concluded the rules on 13.97. In other words, they have concluded on the rest. So on 86 point something, they have agreed, but on 13.97% of the tariff lines, they were not agreed. And these are in some important areas for the continent, like edible oil, sugar, fish, textiles and clothing, which is the most important one, has about almost 10% of tariff lines. Just over 10% are textiles and clothing, and a small percentage are in the automotive sector. So what these countries still have to do is they have to still agree on the rules of origin in these areas, in these outstanding tariff lines, for these goods to be recognized as qualifying in the customs union, in the free trade agreement on the continent. Okay, so as I said to you, the scope of the agreement that we have so far, we have an agreement on trade in goods. It includes a number of technical issues which also have to be implemented, but there are already framework agreements on these, like on the rules of origin, on customs, on trade facilitation, on transit, on non-tariff barriers, on technical barriers to trade, on sanitary and phytosanitary issues, on trade remedies. So lots of issues are discussed, and we have framework agreements, but now they have to be implemented. Similarly, we have a services protocol. So we've agreed on the framework for that agreement, but the actual reductions in the regulations or the barriers at the border have to be agreed. The dispute settlement system, we have a framework that's agreed. We now have to implement it. And then, of course, we are going to move into the next stage of the negotiations, which will be on investment. We foresee a African investment agreement, which will set the rules for intra-regional investments across the continent, intellectual property rights on the continent between ourselves, and a competition policy and possible competition institutions on the continent, and how this will take place. These are still to be negotiated and agreed, but they are on the agenda in phase 2 of the negotiations. So as I did say to you, the Secretariat is now based in Accra, in Ghana, and Wamkele Mene is the Secretary General, appointed as from last year, setting up his office, and we already have some staff, and perhaps some of you may want to apply because they are recruiting and they still have to build their secretariat, and we will see a strengthened secretariat in the next 2 or 3 years. So there will be quite a lot of recruitment taking place over the next few years. Now, the key question that I want to talk about is, how do we make sure that some of the challenges that Niki has outlined in her presentation, the challenges of free trade and its impacts on other countries on the continent, how can we make sure that these negative impacts are reduced as much as possible? And how do we make sure that the agreement is mutually beneficial to all the countries on the continent, and they are helpful also to the smaller countries, and they provide opportunities to the smaller countries and not just the larger, more industrialized economies? We know from the literature and from reading, the press, in the last few years, there has been, and there continues to be, a crisis of free trade and globalization. Trump made this dramatic during his term. The trade wars that he started, between US and China, and in fact, between many other countries in the world, including South Africa. Trump, issued executive orders, put up barriers to trade on a range of issues like steel and aluminium, and caused a lot of tensions, trade tensions. And part of this was because he was arguing that parts of the United States, like the Rust Belt, the Midwest, these states had been depleted of, industries that collapsed, the steel industry, the automotive sector, because many of those workers' jobs had been lost to, industries moving out of these states to Mexico in the south or across to China, across the world. And therefore, he argued that free trade is bad for America. And he said the rules are unfair to America, and he wanted them to be changed. And he started a number of conflicts with many countries, including in the WTO itself. So I think that what we need to do is we do need to address this challenge of how it is that we can address the negative impacts. So whilst Trump, of course, was using trade and the negative impacts of trade to support his own version, his populist version of protectionism in the United States, the issue of trade liberalization and its negative impacts is a global concern. We saw that in Brexit in the UK, and how the UK became the first country ever to withdraw from the European Union, to get out of the European Union, because it said it's not fair, it doesn't work for it, it's harmful to the British economy. This was the argument of those who withdrew. I think that what we do need to do is address the issues of the negative impacts of trade liberalization, what Niki calls in the trade literature the polarizing effect of free trade in a customs union. You would have a polarizing effect. That is, investments will move to the countries that are more industrially developed and build their capacity there and export to others. We've seen this in the European Union itself, how the manufacturing prowess of Germany has eradicated many manufacturers in the south. So I've come up with this idea of developmental regionalism, which has 4 pillars: trade, fair trade, building industrial capacity, cross-border infrastructure, and political cooperation. I'll just say a word about each one. So when I talk about fair trade, it means that what we have to do, we have to ensure that in the way in which we build these trade agreements, particularly between countries with uneven levels of development, like we have in Africa, countries like LDCs, others a bit more developed, like South Africa with a bigger manufacturing base, or Nigeria. How do we ensure that we address the concerns of the smaller countries? Well, we can do that through applying the principle of special and differential treatment, which means that you've got to address the trade impacts on the smaller countries and allow them a little bit more time. So you give them more time to implement. You're more flexible in the way in which you negotiate the rules. You allow them to reduce lesser sectors. So they may have more sensitive sectors. They may want to exclude a few sectors that are very sensitive because these are infant industries and they may be may suffer from the more competitive sectors, and those jobs may just be destroyed. And you need to also ensure that the private sector from the bigger countries, the multinational companies from South Africa, like ShopRite or Vodacom or MTN, they contribute as well to the building of supply capacity in the countries in which they invest. So they must not just invest in these countries and gobble up the local companies or take over the market share or merge or acquire the local producers, but they should build local capacity, enter into joint ventures, try and build supply capacity. And many of these things can be done by building partnerships, and we've done some work on it, which we can talk about. But this is something that has to be discussed by countries and the players, the significant players in the regional integration program on the continent. The second thing we have to do is we have to try to build regional value chains which can compete better on the continent, but also globally. So more and more, the trends in the world are pointing towards regional productive value chains. We see this in East Asia, whereas before, there was a shift towards, say, in the 90s, towards global value chains. I don't know what Andrione is going to say, but I'm sure he's going to point to this changing trend where these global value chains are moving towards concentrating in regions because they then reduce transaction costs. They don't have to have this large, supply lines across the water, and they can more easily collaborate with each other within a region. So, for example, Mexico, US, despite what Trump says, there is a vibrant movement of goods and services back and forth between Mexico and the United States. Sometimes a component can move backwards and forwards several times before the final assembly takes place. So, the car assembly may take place finally, in the United States, but the parts are produced in Mexico. Some of them then get sub-assembled in the US, then back to Mexico, and then back to the US. So, all those transaction costs are easier if it is in a regional context. This is what you see in Southeast Asia. And we can certainly foresee these possibilities on the African continent. We've done some work ourselves in the Mandela School on cotton, textiles, and garments. Some work also on pharmaceuticals now. There's a lot of work going on vaccines and pharmaceuticals. There's work going on in agriculture. And I think we need to explore in many other sectors how these value chains can be developed, which will allow for greater participation of other countries than the bigger countries in production itself on the and trade in manufactured goods on the continent. The third area where we do need to work on in parallel with trade integration is the building of cross-border infrastructure. So as we were saying, the landlocked countries like Zambia or the DRC or Rwanda or Burundi, they can't really export competitively unless they have efficient transport networks, road and rail. And the port, whether it's the port of Beira, for example, if Malawi wants to get its goods, it needs the port of Beira to be functional and effective. It needs the cooperation of Mozambique. And so you do need regional initiatives like we have in Mombasa, between Mombasa and Nairobi, Nairobi to Kigali, and Nairobi to Kisangani. You now have road and rail project that's underway. Most of it has been built. Similarly, in many other parts of the continent, you're beginning to see this happen, but we need more of this to happen so that the smaller countries can become effective trading partners as well and participate in regional trade more efficiently. And finally, I wanted to also put on the table the issue of governance. Now, there I heard Mustaq gave a fabulous lecture on governance and development. He calls it developmental governance, and I agree wholeheartedly with his concept. In fact, next time I write something, I'm going to bring that into this discussion. But the way I see it, the concept of developmental regionalism must also include improvements in governance, because if you do not improve governance, you will have conflict that will flow into the region, will undermine stability, undermine investment, and will increase transaction costs. So this will not support regional integration on the continent. So we've got to work together to help each other to build the necessary institutions of governance and strengthen governance on the continent in a manner which supports development and that relationship between the two, symbiotic relationship between the two. So in this way, we will be able to, if we work on all four pillars simultaneously, in parallel, interacting with each other, we'll get the virtuous circle of regional integration, transformative industrialization, cross-border infrastructure, good governance, peace and security. And this is the way in which I think that we can advance the AfCFTA successfully on the continent. So that's the final point I wanted to make on regional, my lecture on developmental regionalism.